Professor Gilday, how have French protest movements and revolutions shaped French politics? In the last segment, you talked about several different regimes. Have they all been toppled by revolutions? Is that the case?
Well, as I said, the French have this idea of the sovereignty of the people, and that's very clear. But right from the French Revolution, they had a difficulty in organizing the sovereignty of the people. They didn't know what kind of government best to have. So, as I said earlier on, they tried a monarchy, they tried an empire, they tried a republic.
What republic are we in? Is this the fourth or the fifth? Or
this is the Fifth Republic.
Okay, Fifth Republic.
So the First Republic was 1792, the second was 1848, the third was 1870, the fourth was 1944, and then this is 1958. And it's been around for a long time, the Fifth Republic. I mean, the best part of 70 years. But it's kind of some people are already starting to think about, oh, should we have a Sixth Republic, and what would that look like? Because one of the things about the current regime is that the political class, the politicians, have become very alienated from the people. There used to be, for most of the 20th century, for example, there used to be parties like, first of all, the Communist Party and then the Socialist Party, which really did kind of have a popular following, and in a sense kind of made it unnecessary for people to have so much protest, because these parties could kind of act as vehicles for their desires. Since then, those parties have collapsed. Unfortunately, there is a very powerful party, a popular party, but it's the National Front, now called the National Rally of Marine Le Pen, which is a kind of right-wing popular party. But you've also always had in France a very powerful kind of movement of strikes. So a lot of the kind of trade union movements are quite distrustful of political parties and don't line up immediately behind them. Unlike the Labour Party in Britain, for example, the Labour Party in Britain came out of the trade union movement, whereas the trade union movement in France has been very suspicious of political parties. And there's another factor, which is, and this kind of explains, I think, the tensions at the moment, is after the Second World War, the French set up what they called the French social model, and this meant that employers and trade unions would negotiate wages and conditions together, and this ensured kind of job security and decent wages, and it also ensured a kind of strong welfare system for kind of medical welfare, social welfare. And since the kind of,
did that include a pension plan of sorts?
Including pensions. Okay. And but governments since the sort of 1990s have been trying, in the kind of global era and in the era of global competition, French governments, as have other governments worldwide, been trying to grind down these this kind of welfare system and this kind of this system of collective bargaining, and to go over to a much more sort of gig economy and casual work, and again the reduction in pensions. And you might say, well, the French are having this revolt over the pension age being raised from 62 to 64. Well, in Britain it's kind of 67 and possibly going up to 68. And I don't know what it is in the States, but for the French, this is, people sometimes say, the British eat to live and the French live to eat. And this is a country that still has lunch breaks, And I've worked in French provincial towns where, you're working in the archives, and the archive shuts for 2 hours between, midday and 2 p.m. It's shut so that, the staff can go and have their lunch. It's unbelievable. But, so it's unbelievable for an American.
That's like a doctor's office.
But they are, they're holding on to this French social model, and they're going to really fight to protect it.
I'm trying to wrap my brain around comprehending whether or not these protests, these strident voices that we see, do they reflect the sentiments of a highly active and participating minority, or do they represent the majority of the French? Like, are other French saying, oh gosh, another one, stop it? Or are they saying, yes, go, represent us?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think there is a kind of discontented silent majority, but the silent majority is not so silent. I mean, I think the example of the Gilets jaunes and the example of the strike action that we've seen in France in the last couple of months, where everyone's been on strike and power stations have been blockaded and the railways have been on strike, and I mean, this is a really genuinely popular movement, and it's a movement not only not only because the government is trying to take away their French social model, but also because the government forced through these measures without a parliamentary vote, because the President Macron lost his overall majority in the elections last year, so it's a kind of minority government. Propped up by a kind of centre-right party, and they kind of suddenly did their sums a couple of weeks ago, and they realised that they didn't have a majority to get these reforms through. So they kind of used this emergency clause in the constitution to force through the reforms, and then the parliament had a vote of no confidence in the government, which kind of nearly succeeded, but not quite. So there's a huge amount of discontent in the country, and not everyone is going to go on strike, not everyone is going to demonstrate, but people are talking about the big division in France for the last 10 years, and particularly now, is not between left and right as it was for a long time, but between the kind of government and the people, and Macron's government and his kind of rather invented party that he set up for himself. And then you've got a kind of left-wing party, and then you've got a right-wing party who have very different approaches, but they do represent ordinary people. They represent le peuple, and le peuple is not happy.
So the main political positioning right now is not, I'm rephrasing what you just shared with me, between the left and right, is between the government and the people. That's really profound, which kind of makes me think of what you were saying. Some people are proposing a sixth republic. They're saying that the system doesn't work. And I bet Mr. Macron sort of shoving through this reform without a formal vote must have been really offensive. Interesting.
I mean, it's a sort of mini coup d'état. I mean, and people do say, Macron's a bit like Bonaparte. I mean, he's small and he's aggressive and he's a bit and he's authoritarian, and he doesn't really have the common touch.
Are these your sentiments, or are you reflecting what the French are saying, or both?
I mean, I have seen cartoons of Macron, as Napoleon.
Interesting, because of his stature.
Well, it's not just. I mean, in fact, I mean, he has. I think he has, declared his love of Napoleon, and so, it's partly his stature, and it's partly, as I say, he's quite an aggressive little man.
Hopefully, he won't start any wars. In the minute we have left of this segment, I'm going to ask you a question that's a bit vague, I have to admit. Confess this in advance. Do you think France is a better democracy because of these protests?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think it may be a weaker democracy, but let me give you a comparison. Let me give you a comparison with what happened in Britain when the Queen died.
Okay.
When the Queen died in last September, there was a very, very quick succession, and town criers, sort of rather sort of these kind of figures in old ancient costume, rang bells and declared the new monarchy in the cities of England. And there were one or two protests. For example, one woman held up a piece of cardboard which said, "Abolish the monarchy, F ... imperialism." And she was arrested. Another guy, a lawyer, held up a piece of paper. It was a blank piece of paper. He was arrested just in case there was something rude on the piece of paper. So, there was a sense in Britain that, suddenly one monarch dies, another one succeeds, and we don't have the right to say, "Excuse me, no one asked me." So I think there's a sense in Britain that, we live in a kind of monarchical regime where it's quite difficult to protest, although there have been lots of strikes in the last, during the last winter. Whereas I think in France, there's a kind of healthy right to protest and a kind of almost a love of protest, and a feeling that, as I say, at the end of the day, the people is sovereign, and le peuple, has got the right to go onto the streets and say, "We're not happy with this and we want something else."
So why do you say the riots or protests have made France a weaker democracy? Why do you say that then? It would seem what you're proposing almost supports the opposite, that there are a stronger democracy.
You could say it makes it more responsive. I mean, there are plenty of cases, in the 1980s, and the case we mentioned in 1995. There are instances where the protest does force the government to pull back. It does force the government to change its, to withdraw its reforms. Whereas in Britain, for example, we're about to mark 40 years since the miners' strike of 1984-85. The miners went on strike for a whole year against pit closures. Mrs. Thatcher just kept fighting and fighting and fighting. She would not give an inch, and eventually she defeated the miners and she defeated the trade union movement. And there's a sense in Britain, the government is very reluctant to give ground, whereas I think in France, the kind of government sees the writing on the wall and does give ground, and then that kind of encourages them, because the next time there's a reform that people don't like, they're out on the streets and they've got a 50-50 chance of having the reform withdrawn, as is the case today. It may be that this reform falls. We don't know.
Yeah. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Professor Gilday as we get into perspective.